Let's start with a hard truth, the kind most people avoid because it cuts too deep. Missing you doesn't begin when you walk away. It begins when you stop turning back. The biggest lie we've been sold, especially as women, is that silence equals weakness, that if you care, you must chase, that if you're quiet, you must be bitter. But what if I told you that silence, when done with intention, is not just powerful, it's transformational? Here's the question we're really here to answer. When do they start missing you for real? Not the surface-level kind, not the ego-driven guilt, but the soul-deep ache that hits when the noise clears and they realize they've lost something they never truly valued when they had it. Think about that, because most people don't. Most people are stuck reacting, reaching, explaining, overgiving, hoping that one more message, one more apology, one more chance to be seen will finally make the difference. But you've tried that, haven't you? And it didn't work. Not because you weren't enough, but because they never had to feel your absence in full force. That's where we shift. This video is not about playing games. It's not about manipulation. It's about tapping into Stoicism, that ancient, unshakable mindset that teaches us how to lead with power, not panic. Because in Stoic relationships, we stop begging for understanding and start standing in our silence. So what's the problem? You've been taught to fear quiet, to assume if you don't speak, if you don't reach, you'll be forgotten. But the truth is the opposite. Silence, true silence, becomes a mirror. And trust me, they can't handle what they see. In fact, silence speaks in a language the ego cannot translate. And when you understand how it works psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, you will never look at distance the same again. Right now, they're not missing you. Not really, their ego is still in control. But give it time, because every day that you hold the line, every hour you resist that urge to chase, you turn the volume up on their own inner storm. They don't feel it yet, but oh, they will. So the real question is not if they'll miss you, but when. When does the shift happen? When does the silence break them? When does the illusion of control collapse and the weight of losing you finally sink in? In this journey, spanning 30 days of intentional stillness, we're going to break it all down, stage by stage. We'll tap into the psychology of ego, the subtle power of absence, and the undeniable pressure that builds when someone who thought you'd always be there starts realizing you're no longer chasing. Each phase is layered, each shift is real. And by the end of this, you won't just understand when they start missing you for real. You'll realize how deeply you've changed in the process, because that's the secret no one tells you. This isn't about making them miss you. It's about becoming someone who no longer needs to be missed to know her worth. You ready for that shift? Stay locked in, because the part that breaks them is also the part that builds you. And by the time we hit day 30, you'll see why Stoic relationships don't crumble in silence. They reveal the truth through it. Let's begin. On days 1-5, the ego holds the throne. In the first few days after you go silent, nothing on the outside seems to shift, but inside them, a subtle war has already begun. Not a war they'll admit to, not one they even recognize right away. Because in these first moments of your absence, their ego sits tall and proud on the throne, completely convinced it still rules the dynamic. They believe you'll come back. Why wouldn't you? You always have. You texted first. You apologized even when they were in the wrong. You were the one filling in the silences, chasing the connection, trying to be heard. So now, your silence doesn't yet feel like a loss. It feels like a pause, like a game, like something temporary. But that illusion, that delusion, is built on a fragile structure, the belief that they are still in control. And this is where Stoicism steps in and exposes the first layer of truth. Control is always temporary, especially when it's based on someone else's emotional labor. See, in these first 5 days, they're still operating from the past. They're still living in the pattern you used to reinforce, the rhythm where you always reached back, where you always made things right. They're not missing you yet, because their mind has them convinced you'll break the silence eventually. They're banking on it. But what they don't realize is that something has shifted. Not just your actions, but your mindset. You're no longer responding from fear. You're not reacting to emptiness. You're standing in power, in stillness, in the kind of presence that doesn't beg to be felt. And that quiet becomes a mirror. But not yet. Right now, their ego is doing what it does best, distracting them, propping up stories, narrating a fantasy where you're still hooked, where you're just waiting for the right moment to cave. They might even feel smug. They might post more, act indifferent, tell themselves and others that everything is fine. But inside that confidence is a dangerous crack forming. A crack they can't see yet, but one that will grow with every day you hold your silence. In Stoic relationships, the real shift isn't about tactics. It's about breaking the pattern of emotional dependence. And the ego, by its nature, despises change, especially when that change means the end of control. What's wild is that the ego doesn't panic in these early days. It postures, it inflates, it puts on a show. Imagine them in front of a house, of mirrors, seeing only the distorted reflections that feed their superiority. Every mirror says the same thing. They'll be back. They always are. So they believe it. They take your silence as a challenge, not as a boundary. They interpret your stillness as uncertainty, not confidence. But let's be honest, what's really happening beneath all that bravado? Nothing. That's the point. Because silence, in its earliest stages, doesn't feel loud, it feels like absence. And people who are used to emotional noise, texting wars, dramatic apologies, late-night makeups, they don't know how to interpret absence. So their mind goes into a kind of psychological limbo. It tries to fill the space with stories. She's probably busy. She's just waiting for me to reach out first. She won't last more than a few days. These aren't just thoughts. They're defense mechanisms crafted by an ego that would rather be deluded than humbled. That's the danger of false power. It keeps them from recognizing the storm brewing beneath their feet. And you're the storm. But you're not. Raging, you're not dramatic. You're the kind of storm that looks like still water until the cracks form and the ground collapses. That's what Stoicism teaches us, not to fight louder, but to become so unmoved that our absence becomes unbearable. So while they sit in their throne, comfortable and smug, you are already shifting the energy of the entire connection. And the real irony, they won't even realize it. Not yet, because the ego isn't built to detect subtle change. It's built to ignore it. It smooths over early discomfort. It reassures them that everything is fine. And so for 5 long days, they believe it. They stay in their comfort zone, convinced they're still the one in control. But what they don't know is that silence isn't still. It's growing. And every second you don't reach out, you don't explain, you don't chase, the throne they're sitting on begins to tilt. That's the power of Stoic relationships, where you stop begging to be chosen and start choosing yourself so radically that they can't make sense of your stillness. And here's where the real test begins. Not for them, but for you, because your ego is talking too. Your mind is whispering, just check their story. Send something subtle. It's not a big deal to say hi, but it is, because the second you break the silence, you reset the pattern, you put their ego back on the throne, and all the progress, the cracks forming beneath their feet, vanish. So you hold, you breathe, you trust. And every time you don't give in, you rewire your nervous system, you reclaim your power, and you deepen the pressure. Because they don't miss you yet, but they will. And it starts with this, letting the ego sit on its throne, completely unaware that the ground it rules is already beginning to shake. This is Stoicism in action. It's not glamorous, It's not dramatic, but it's transformative. And the moment they realize something is different, truly different, it will be too late to go back to the dynamic they once took for granted. So now the question becomes, how long can you hold? How long can you stay silent in a world that expects women to chase, explain, fix? How long can you trust that your presence is powerful enough to be felt even in absence? Because the clock is ticking, and while they feel confident in their illusion, you are becoming the quiet force that shatters it. The throne will not hold. The ego will not win. And the silence, that silence is already doing its work. Welcome to day 1. Stay steady. 2 days, 6 to 10. The pattern breaks. It doesn't take a dramatic moment to break someone's certainty. It takes disruption. Quiet disruption. The kind that doesn't knock on the door, but removes it altogether. And that's what begins to unfold between day 6 and day 10 of your silence. You're not just gone. You're no longer predictable. You're not reaching out, not reacting, not responding in the ways they've come to rely on. And that shift, though subtle, starts bending the foundation of their ego. You have to understand, the human brain is hardwired to seek patterns. Patterns create safety. They form the rules by which we live, love, and survive emotionally. In relationships, patterns become identities. Your role, their role, how conflict is resolved, who apologizes first, who breaks the silence. So when that pattern breaks, it's not just inconvenient for them, it's psychologically destabilizing. And in Stoic relationships, that destabilization isn't caused by manipulation, it's caused by growth. Because you're no longer feeding their comfort zone. You've stopped dancing the old dance. And while they may not admit it out loud, their brain has already noticed. There's no good morning text, no story reactions, no little reminders of your presence. At first, they dismiss it. They tell themselves you're just busy, maybe taking space. But then the mind begins to loop. Questions start rising. Not panic, not yet, but curiosity laced with attention they haven't felt before. Why haven't I heard from her? Is she still mad? Did something shift? They don't know yet, but they feel it. That's the ripple effect. And ripples are dangerous for someone whose self-worth has been propped up by the illusion of being irreplaceable. This is where the psychology deepens. See, when someone becomes used to a cycle, especially one that feeds their ego, they stop questioning its reliability. They assume your love is on demand, that your energy is renewable, that your forgiveness is guaranteed. But silence breaks that assumption. And what they don't realize is that silence isn't just a gap. It's an introduction to unfamiliar territory. And the unfamiliar is terrifying, especially for the ego, because the ego doesn't know how to survive without attention, without reinforcement, without proof that it still matters. This is where things start to twist inside them. They check their phone more often, not obsessively, not yet, but enough to catch themselves doing it. They scroll your feed, not liking anything, of course, not engaging, but watching. They're quiet, but not at peace. And here's where Stoicism holds its power. You, in contrast, are grounded. You are not disturbed by their silence because your silence is chosen. It's not a reaction, it's a statement. One they can't read, and that's what unnerves them. Because up until now, they've had the manual on how to manage you. Press this button, she responds. Pull this string, she reaches out. But now you've taken the manual away. You've stepped out of the script, and that sends their minds spinning. Maybe they replay your last conversation. Maybe they reread the texts. Maybe they wonder if there was a signal they missed. But here's the thing, they can't find it. Because the shift wasn't in your words, it was in your energy. And energy doesn't leave fingerprints, it leaves absence. A quiet kind of void that gets louder the more they try to ignore it. And now their inner narrative starts to evolve. It goes from, she's just being distant, to, Is she over it? And that question is the first real crack in the mirror. They won't say it out loud, they won't tell their friends, but they're thinking it. Did I push too far? Did I take her for granted? That's not guilt yet, it's confusion, a slow unraveling of their perceived position in your world. Because if you're not chasing, if you're not trying to fix, if you're not craving their validation, then who are you? And if you no longer need them the way you used to, then what power do they really have? These are the questions that haunt them quietly in the back of their mind. Not in a rush, not in a scream, but in the slow, deliberate dripping of uncertainty, and nothing tortures the ego more than not knowing. That's what Stoicism teaches us. That strength is found not in forcing answers, but in allowing space for others to wrestle with their own. That silence isn't cold, it's clarifying, and as you stay silent, something even more subtle begins to happen. They start testing. Not directly, of course, they're not ready to face the loss yet, but maybe they post a story designed to catch your attention. Maybe a quote about independence, a song lyric, something vague. They want to see if you're still watching. If you'll break your silence, but you don't, because you've outgrown the game, and now their second narrative begins. Maybe she really is done. And that phrase, just that phrase, is enough to shift everything inside them. Because now your silence isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. It threatens the very identity they've built around your connection. It challenges their belief that they were needed, that they were the center, that they could disappear for a little while and return to find you waiting. But you're not waiting, you're evolving, and that evolution feels like rejection to someone who never expected you to change. It feels like betrayal to their ego, even though all you've done is remove yourself from a pattern that was killing your self-respect. This is where Stoic relationships reveal their quiet magic. You are not performing, you are not manipulating. You are simply refusing to play a role that was never designed to honor your worth. And that refusal becomes a message louder than any text. They start noticing the gap. It's not just digital, it's emotional, energetic, spiritual. They feel less seen, less validated, less central. And the irony, the more they try to ignore it, the more present it becomes. Silence is now the most deafening sound in their world. And you're not even trying. That's the shift, that's the power, because the moment you stop chasing is the moment they start questioning. And once that questioning begins, it can't be stopped. Not easily, not quickly, not without facing something they've avoided, their own ego. The truth that maybe they weren't as indispensable as they thought. The realization that maybe, just maybe, your love was never about them, it was about what you were willing to give. And now that you've stopped giving, they don't know who they are to you anymore. That identity loss is subtle, but it burns. And every time they feel that itch to reach out and don't, it grows. Every time they check their phone and see nothing from you, the ripple gets wider. This is not revenge, this is not strategy, this is clarity. And if you've made it to this point, you're already walking a path that few people have the strength to stay on. Because the temptation to test the waters, to send just one message, is so real. But every time you resist that urge, you deepen the impact. You let the silence do what no words ever could. You let it break the pattern. And when that pattern is broken, their ego no longer has a home. It can't find safety in the script. It can't predict your next move. And in that unpredictability, the real transformation begins. That's when the dynamic shifts. That's when you stop being the pursuer and become the mystery. And mysteries are unforgettable. So now I ask you, what role are you playing? Are you still showing up from habit? From fear, from need, or have you stepped into the quiet, confident stillness of someone who knows her worth? Because if you have, you already know what comes next. The silence is working, the pattern is broken, and they are beginning to feel it. like a ripple in still water that grows with every passing moment. So, if this resonates, if you feel this shift happening in real time, let me know in the comments. Like this video and drop number 1 below if this part spoke to you. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and stay close. Because the next part of this journey is where the cracks begin to spread. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the reflection finally shatters. 3 days, 11:15, the cracks in their mirror. By day 11, the silence is no longer just a question. It's an answer they're not ready to hear. The ego, which once sat confidently on its throne, begins to feel a shift it cannot ignore. And it doesn't crumble all at once, because ego never shatters in daylight. It fractures quietly, in the dark, beneath the surface. These cracks begin when their internal narrative starts contradicting reality. They told themselves you'd return. They believed the old rhythm would resume. But it hasn't. You're still silent, still absent, still unmoved. And this is where the mirror they've been looking into, the one that reflected back their control, their importance, their confidence, begins to betray them. Slowly, at first, a subtle warping, a faint fracture down the center of what used to be certainty. The illusion begins to bend. The ego, unable to control the silence, begins to feel threatened by it. This is the moment Stoic relationships become most powerful, not because of what's said, but because of what's withheld. Your silence is no longer just space. It's pressure, it's reflection, and it's becoming unbearable. Now, they're not just curious, they're unsettled. They begin replaying things in their mind, conversations they brushed off, moments where you gave too much, times they dismissed your needs. They scroll through old messages, not because they miss you, but because they're looking for a clue. Something to anchor them to the belief that you're still emotionally available, that you'll still come back, but they can't find it. Because the evidence is gone. You've stopped performing. You've stopped explaining. You've stopped showing up the way they expect. And in Stoicism, this is the moment of internal confrontation, when someone is forced to face themselves, not through conflict, but through the mirror of your stillness. Now they're beginning to see things, not the truth all at once, but glimpses, fractured images in a mirror that's beginning to split. And those glimpses are uncomfortable, painful, humbling, because for the first time, they're seeing themselves not as the person you adored, but as the person who drove you to silence. And here's what the ego does when faced with that truth. It fights, it panics in disguise, it clings harder to denial, so they distract themselves, they post more, they stay busy, they talk louder, but the cracks are still spreading, because silence has no expiration date. It doesn't weaken with time, it deepens. And every day that you remain silent, their reflection becomes harder to recognize. They start to feel exposed, not because you've accused them of anything, but because they can no longer hide behind your reassurance. This is where their internal questions become internal conflict. Did I push too hard? Was I too cold? Did I take her for granted? They won't admit it out loud, not yet. But inside, the battle has begun. They want to reach out, but pride won't let them. They want to ignore it, but the silence is louder now. And here's the irony. They still don't know if they miss you or if they miss being missed by you. That distinction is critical, because missing you means they see your value. Missing being missed means they're still operating from ego. And right now they're stuck in between. They're beginning to realize that the game is changing, but they haven't figured out how to play without their old tactics. They throw emotional bait, liking an old photo, posting a story they hope you'll see, sharing a song that once meant something. They want to provoke a reaction, not because they're ready to face you, but because they're desperate to test if they still matter, but you don't react. And that silence becomes devastating, because every ignored post, every unanswered test reinforces what they fear the most, that you're no longer emotionally available, that you're no longer watching, that you've stepped fully into your own power. In Stoic relationships, this is where the lines begin to shift. You are no longer the emotional caregiver. You are no longer giving away your energy to prove your worth. And the ego cannot survive that kind of starvation. So now they start questioning everything, not just your silence, but their past behavior, their choices, their assumptions, the false belief that you would always be there, always forgive, always return. That belief is dying, and the death of ego is never clean. It's messy, it's full of resistance, but it's happening. You can't see it, you won't hear it, but inside them the mirror has cracked beyond repair. They begin to feel regret, not the performative kind, but the kind that keeps you up at night, the kind that whispers at 2 a.m. What if she's really gone? And that's the scariest question of all, not because they can't find someone else, but because deep down they know they misjudged your love, they misused your loyalty, they misunderstood your silence. They thought you were waiting, but now they're not so sure, and that uncertainty is what breaks them, because it forces them to confront the truth. They were not as important to you as they believed, or maybe they were, but they're not anymore. And the difference between those two ideas, that's the crack that becomes the canyon. So now, every memory of you is tinged with fear. Every photo, every place, every shared joke. It doesn't bring comfort anymore. It brings unease. Because the silence has changed the story. You're not the same woman who cried, chased, explained. You're the woman who disappeared and didn't leave breadcrumbs behind, and they don't know how to process that because your silence has forced a revelation. They were never in control. They only felt in control because you gave. You offered. You filled the silence, and now without your presence they're exposed, raw, alone with their own reflection. And in Stoicism, that's when the truth is clearest. Not when we're speaking, but when we're listening to the echo of our own actions. And what they hear now in that echo is the sound of self-inflicted loss. You didn't take anything from them. You didn't punish them. You simply stopped feeding the illusion. And in that moment, the ego no longer sees a throne. It sees a grave of what could have been, what should have been, if only they'd seen you clearly when they had the chance. That's what the cracks reveal. Not your weakness, but their blindness. Not your silence, but their noise. Not your absence, but their inability to value your presence. And once that realization sets in, they can't go back to the story they were telling themselves. It doesn't hold, it doesn't comfort, it doesn't make sense anymore. The cracks have spread too far, and all that's left is reflection. And reflection, as every Stoic knows, is where transformation begins. 4 days 1620, fear of replacement sets in. By the time day 16 arrives, the silence has evolved into something heavier. It's no longer just absence, it's an undeniable void. And here, deep in the space you've left behind, something primal begins to stir inside them. It's not just regret, it's not just confusion, it's fear, raw, unfiltered fear, but not of losing you in a technical sense. No, this fear is deeper. It's the fear of being replaced. And that fear is not simply emotional, it is existential for the ego, because ego doesn't crumble from distance, it crumbles from irrelevance. When someone is no longer sure if their place in your life is secure, the mind starts inventing stories to explain the silence. Stories that feel so real, they begin to believe them. She's probably talking to someone else. She must have found better. Maybe I wasn't enough. And these thoughts, though whispered internally, begin to dominate their emotional landscape, but they won't show it. Not yet. Outwardly, they'll keep up the performance. They'll post pictures, they'll throw out quotes about peace, self-love, independence, because the performance is the only thing the ego has left. But inside it's a storm. Because when they believed you were still waiting, they could delay accountability. They could postpone self-reflection. But now, they feel you slipping further away, and with every day of silence, the throne they once occupied feels colder, more unfamiliar, more exposed. Stoic relationships don't just end with distance, they evolve through it. And now, your evolution is undeniable. You are no longer orbiting their world, you are rebuilding your own. And that, to someone who thought they were the center of your emotional gravity, is terrifying. Because now, the question isn't, will she come back? The question becomes, has someone else taken my place? And once that question forms, it spreads. It takes root. It eats away at their pride, their peace, their constructed narrative of control. It's not just jealousy, it's displacement. It's realizing they may have been replaced without ever getting the chance to fight for the position they thought was permanent. This is the consequence of underestimating someone who gave deeply. When you give fully and then walk away without a sound, it forces people to confront the reality of what they lost. And not because you threw it in their face, but because they feel the absence in every corner of their life, in every message you're no longer sending, in every moment you used to fill, in every heartbeat that used to skip for the attention. They now fear you're giving to someone else, and they try to shake it off. They try to stay grounded, but the brain under stress does not seek facts, it seeks conclusions. And the conclusion they land on is the one that hurts the most. They've been replaced. That thought doesn't arrive calmly. It explodes. It shatters the last fragments of their ego, because once someone fears they've been replaced, they begin rewriting history. Not because it's true, but because the silence forces them to fill in the blanks. This is where Stoicism reveals its depth. Because while they spiral into emotional chaos, you remain still. You remain composed. You remain silent. Not because you are empty, but because you are full of clarity. And that contrast is unbearable. You are the calm in their storm. You are the steady light while they drown in shadows they created. Now, they check everything obsessively. Your social media, your online status, who you're liking, who's liking you. They look for signs, and when they can't find them, they invent them. She looks happier. She's definitely seeing someone. That quote must be about me or someone new. But here's the irony. They still won't reach out directly, because pride is the last mask the ego wears. And they don't want to look weak, but internally they've already unraveled. The very idea that you could be loving someone else, laughing with someone else, building with someone else, it's unthinkable. Not because they loved you right, but because they believed you'd always be available. That's the silent contract they wrote without your consent. The contract that said no matter how they treated you, you would stay. But you broke that contract, not with words, but with stillness. And now, their world is spinning. Every interaction feels like a threat. Every man you follow, every photo you post, every moment you shine without them. It all confirms what they fear most. You are not waiting. You are not longing. You are not suffering. You are living. And the ego cannot accept that. Because the ego assumes ownership, not connection. The ego believes love is leverage, not reciprocity. And when that illusion dies, it triggers desperation. But that desperation wears a mask. It pretends not to care. It posts louder, it parties harder, it seeks validation from anyone who will offer it, but none of it lands. Because the only validation that matters now is the one they can't get. You. This is the shadow phase, the part they won't show the world, the part where the silence eats away at every fabricated story they told themselves. They thought they could do better. They thought you'd always be there. They thought you couldn't walk away. But now they know you can, you did, and you're doing it with grace. That grace is what destroys them, because anger would have been easier. A dramatic goodbye would have given them closure. But silence. Silence gives them nothing. And in that nothing, they see everything. They see how much you held, how much you gave, how much you sacrificed, and how little they truly appreciated it. And as those realizations hit, the fear of being replaced is no longer abstract. It's visceral. It becomes physical. It becomes the reason they can't sleep. The reason their appetite is off. The reason their mind won't stop spinning. And every attempt to move on feels like betrayal. Not of you, but of themselves. Because they know they had something real. And they know they lost it. Not because you left, but because they didn't see your worth until you were gone. And now someone else might. That's the knife, not the silence, not even the distance. But the possibility that someone else will love you better. That someone else will see you clearly, that someone else will do what they didn't, and they don't know how to live with that, because the ego is addicted to being irreplaceable, and you've proven that no one is, not even them. That's the lesson silence teaches, not just to the one who's hurt, but to the one who hurt them. And now they are both. Hurt by their own choices, wounded by their own blindness, haunted by the very possibility that they could be forgotten. That fear changes them. It softens the pride. It shakes the arrogance. It forces a reckoning they cannot escape. And while they may not reach out yet, trust this, they feel everything. They just don't know how to express it without admitting defeat. But the silence does not care about their timeline. It keeps pressing. It keeps revealing. It keeps burning away the lies until all that's left is the truth. They had you. And now they don't. And that absence is being filled, whether by someone else or simply by your own peace. That's the part they never expected, that you would heal without them, that you would grow without them, that you would shine brighter in silence than you ever did in conversation. And now that shine haunts them. So if this resonates with what you're feeling right now, if this phase speaks to where you are, like this video and comment number 1 below. Let others know that you're not alone in this experience. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, because the next part is where the silence becomes too heavy for them to bear. And when it breaks, it does not break quietly. 5 days, 21-25. Desperation in disguise. Desperation never announces itself honestly. It hides behind confidence, distractions, and digital smiles. By the time you reach days 21 through 25, the silence has worked its way deep into their psyche, cutting past ego and fear and into something far more fragile, their identity. The cracks that once fractured their sense of control have now spread into their sense of self, and even though they won't show it on the surface, the desperation has begun to settle. In behind the mask, on the outside, nothing has changed. They're still posting, still liking, still showing up in ways designed to create the illusion that they're unbothered, but you know better now. Stoic relationships teach you that performance is rarely a reflection of peace. It's a distraction from chaos, and inside them there is chaos. The kind that can't be measured in words or explained to others because it contradicts the persona they've carefully crafted. They can't admit they miss you. They can't admit they're unraveling. So instead, they double down on the image. They post harder. They laugh louder. They tell mutual friends they're fine, great even. They flirt publicly. They become active in the ways that scream, "Look at me," while pretending not to care who's watching. But it's not about being seen by the world, it's about being seen by you. That's the silent motivation behind every move they make now. And the more you stay silent, the more desperate their attempts become. But desperation has many faces. Sometimes it looks like indifference. Sometimes it looks like resilience. But in this phase, it often looks like overcompensation. They work out more. They go out more. They flood their schedule with people and places and noise because the silence you've left behind has created a vacuum, and that vacuum echoes their own inner voice. That voice keeps whispering the same. question, why hasn't she reached out? It's no longer a curious inquiry. It's a torment. It chips away at them every hour, every check of their phone, every look through old pictures they said they'd deleted but kept. And still, they don't break. They don't message. Why? Because the pride is still clinging to its last defense, the mask. The mask that says, I'm okay. The mask that says she'll reach out eventually, but the cracks in that mask are now visible, at least to themselves. Every day they wake up and feel the silence pressing against them. They lose a little more certainty, and with that uncertainty comes confusion. They no longer know where they stand. They no longer know who they are to you. And without that clarity, they're forced to confront the possibility that you've moved on, that you've chosen peace over their chaos, that you've outgrown the version of yourself that would have broken the silence by now. This is the part where the stories they tell themselves begin to collapse. The narrative they've leaned on to preserve their confidence, that you were just being emotional, that this would blow over, that they were still in control. Those stories no longer hold. And without a narrative, there's only reality. And reality in its rawest form is that they might have lost you, not to someone else, but to yourself, to your growth, to your decision to no longer participate in a connection that demanded your effort but denied your value. That truth stings, and instead of facing it, they perform harder, because performance is easier than reflection. It's easier to show the world a curated version of healing than to admit you're hurting. But here's what they didn't expect. Your silence doesn't just hold steady, it expands. It becomes a mirror, and now everything they post, everything they say, everything they do is done with the hope that you'll notice, that you'll break, that you'll reach out and relieve them of the emotional weight they no longer know how to carry. But you don't, because you've learned that power doesn't come from being seen. It comes from being centered, from staying grounded in your choice to no longer feed a dynamic that drained you. And that choice, that consistency, becomes unbearable for them. Because now they feel exposed, vulnerable, powerless. And yet, they can't admit it. So instead, they keep the mask on. They joke more. They talk about how free they feel. They tell people they're focused on themselves. But it's a lie. Not because they aren't trying to move on, but because the foundation of that movement is built on denial, not peace. And denial always crumbles. Eventually, behind the scenes, they're doing everything they swore they wouldn't. Checking your profile, rewatching your stories, asking about you indirectly. They want to know what you're doing, who you're with, how you're feeling. But they want that information without having to ask. Because asking would mean surrender, and they're not ready for that yet. But every day that you don't show up, every day that you don't crack under the pressure of their subtle provocations, you become more distant in their mind. Not physically, spiritually, emotionally, energetically. And that distance hurts more than they expected, because it makes them feel like they're losing something they didn't realize they needed until it was gone. And that need, that quiet, growing need, is what turns fear into desperation. Desperation to reclaim the version of you that once gave freely, that once fought for the connection, that once chose them, even when they weren't choosing you fully. But you're not that version anymore. You've evolved, and your evolution has made their mask impossible to wear. Because every smile they fake, every story they post, every attempt to prove they're thriving is now contrasted by your silence. And silence always wins against noise, because silence doesn't require validation. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't rely on the outside to justify the inside. It just is. And that being is what breaks them. It breaks the illusion. It breaks the confidence. It breaks the carefully curated mask they've shown to the world, because inside they are falling apart, and they don't know who to blame. They can't blame you, because you're not doing anything. They can't blame themselves, because that would require accountability. So they blame the silence. But silence, my friend, is not the villain, it's the mirror, and mirrors do not lie. They simply reflect, and what they see now is the truth of what they lost, the truth of what they dismissed, the truth of who they've become. And that truth is unbearable without distraction, so they distract until they can't anymore, until the mask no longer fits, until the silence becomes louder than the noise. And when that moment comes, they will either collapse or finally reach out. But until then, understand this: their performance is not power. Their silence is not peace. And their distance is not clarity, it's desperation, masked, painted, and disguised, but desperation nonetheless. And your silence? It is not empty, it is full of strength, full of direction, full of a presence that refuses to be diminished just to soothe someone else's denial. This is Stoicism, not in theory, but in practice. And while they wear their mask for the world, you wear your power like armor, quiet, steady, undeniable. 6 days, 26 to 30, the ego collapses and truth sinks in. When the ego collapses, the silence becomes unbearable and the truth can no longer be denied. By the time day 26 rolls around, something in them breaks. Not cracks, not fractures, breaks. It's not loud, it's not cinematic, it's internal, silent, sudden, but it changes everything, because the ego, that last line of defense they've clung to, chest puffed, mask on, pride intact, can't hold up under the weight of silence anymore. And so it folds in on itself. Everything they believed about themselves, about you, about the connection, about their control over it, shatters. This isn't fear anymore. This isn't overcompensation, this is realization. The deep, cellular recognition that something sacred has been lost. And the most haunting part, they did it to themselves. Your silence hasn't just shaken them, it has forced them to see themselves clearly. No filters, no narratives, no applause, just reflection. And that reflection is devastating, because they see it all now. Not just the things they did, but the things they didn't do, the way they dismissed your love, the way they mocked your vulnerability, the way they assumed your presence was permanent. And in that moment, the silence becomes a storm, not outside, but inside their own mind. It floods them with memory, with regret, with the echo of words they never said, and the weight of the ones they did. Stoic relationships always lead here, not because they are cold, but because they are true. Because when you remove the noise, the only thing left is the truth. And truth, when it's been ignored too long, hits like a tidal wave. That's where they are now, drowning in clarity, replaying every moment you stood in front of them, offering love they weren't mature enough to hold. And suddenly, they aren't mad at you anymore. They're not waiting for you to chase. They're not thinking about who else is in your life. They're thinking about the version of themselves that ruined something they can't get back. They start to spiral, not outwardly, they won't show it. They might even seem more quiet, more reserved, but that's not peace, that's collapse. The ego, stripped of its power, no longer has the energy to pretend, and so they retreat into their mind, into your old messages, into songs that remind them of you, into memories they thought they could bury, but now resurface like ghosts that won't let them sleep. They think about reaching out. They type, delete, type again, but nothing sounds right, because nothing they say can undo the reality that they waited too long. And now, the silence is not your weapon, it is your boundary. It is the container that holds your self-respect, your peace, your evolution. They know it, and it paralyzes them. Because reaching out now doesn't just require words. It requires humility. It requires surrender. It requires facing a version of you that may no longer love them the way you once did. And that is terrifying, because they can feel that shift. You've changed. They don't know how, or when, or why, but they can sense it in the way you haven't flinched, in the way you haven't reached, in the way you disappeared without slamming the door. It's the quiet kind of strength, the kind that says, I didn't leave to punish you, I left to protect me, and they feel that now. They feel it in every second they spend, staring at a screen that once lit up with your name, and now only shows silence. They feel it in every smile they fake for the outside world while they're drowning inside. They feel it in the way they start to lose interest in distractions. The gym doesn't hit the same. The parties feel empty. The people they tried to replace you with feel shallow, because none of it touches the place in them that your presence once did. And that's the collapse. That's the moment they finally understand the depth of what they lost. And maybe for the first time in their life, they don't just feel pain, they feel accountability. They don't want to fix you anymore. They want to fix themselves. Because your silence has shown them that no one is immune to loss, that no matter how confident they are, how attractive they are, how many options they have, none of it means anything if they can't show up for someone who gave them everything. And now in this new awareness, they aren't just missing you. They are mourning you, mourning what you were, mourning what they destroyed, mourning the version of themselves that let pride dictate the story. And the worst part, they still can't fix it. Because they still haven't earned the right to speak. They know that now. They know that silence this long, this powerful, cannot be broken with a weak apology or a vague, "How have you been?" It would insult the depth of the journey. It would diminish the storm. And so they sit with it, with the shame, with the regret, with the weight of knowing that someone once chose them without hesitation, and they met that love with ego. And that ego, in its final gasp, collapses into silence of its own. This is where the two of you meet again, not in words, not in messages, but in silence. You, the still ocean, them, the ship that's taken on too much water. And for once, they aren't angry at the waves. They are grateful, grateful to feel something real. Because for the first time in years, they are facing themselves. Not the image they show the world, but the person in the mirror. And that person is broken, but not beyond repair. Because this collapse, as painful as it is necessary. It is the only way they will ever rebuild with integrity. And you're not watching this happen. You don't need to. Because this part was never about them. It was always about you. About you becoming someone who no longer sacrifices her peace for potential, someone who no longer stays small so others can feel big, someone who no longer sees love as something to earn, but something to receive. That's the transformation the silence has given you. And now you hold all the power, not to control, but to choose. And they know that. They feel it in their bones. That the next move, if there is one, is not theirs, it's yours, and that knowledge humbles them. So if this phase spoke to something deep inside you, if you felt this shift, this collapse, this realization, like this video, and drop number 1 in the comments below. Let the world know you've made it to the part where truth, no longer hurts, it heals. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because in the final phase, the mirror reflects not just them, but everything they could have been if they had only seen you clearly from the start. So now you've seen it, all of it. The ego's illusion, the slow burn of silence, the unraveling, the mirror, the collapse. You've walked through the days they thought you'd fold, the nights they convinced themselves you were still hooked, and the moments they began to panic when your energy never returned. And now you know the truth. They don't miss you in the beginning. They miss you when their identity starts to crumble in your absence, when their certainty fades, when their own reflection begins to look unfamiliar, when the silence becomes the most honest thing in the room. That's when they miss you for real, not because of what you said, not because of what you did, but because you stopped doing what they always expected, chasing, explaining, proving, saving. And in that withdrawal, they were finally forced to confront the damage they caused, the value they never recognized, and the fact that the love they thought was guaranteed had become a ghost, and not a haunting one, a sacred one. You didn't disappear, you transformed into someone who no longer participates in emotional games, into someone who no longer builds intimacy on conditions, into someone who understands that love doesn't require suffering to be real. This is what Stoic relationships are built on, not strategy, but sovereignty. The ability to remain unmoved by performance, undisturbed by pride, and unavailable to anything that does not honor your worth. You're not here to be remembered as the one who cared too much. You're here to be revered as the one who walked away without slamming the door and never looked back. That's where real missing begins. Not in your absence, but in their awakening. When they realize they didn't just lose you, they lost the version of themselves that was capable of being loved by you. And that is a truth they will never silence.